So thanks for having me here. I'm very excited, a bit nervous, but I'm sure it's going to be fine. So my topic is a bit different from the others. So it's not about manufacturing. So I was really enjoying to learn about it. So it's all about compliance for glass and ceramicware with regards to food contact. And we're going to do it on a global level because I guess you guys, you might export to different markets, and maybe you've been wondering, like, what are the compliance requirements for different markets? Is it all the same? So can I just do one test and just check off all the different countries, or like what is exactly the difference? And we're gonna explore that throughout this presentation. So these are the markets we're gonna look into. So I'm gonna start with North America. We're gonna look into the European Union and finish with Asia. And so I put North America first because I think this is what we are all the most familiar with. And so in the US, I'm pretty sure that you're all aware of the FDA, Food and Drug Administration. So they're in charge of food contact materials here in the US. And they have different means to take care of that. So they first of all have the Title 21 Code of Federal Regulations. So most of materials are regulated under these. So like, for example, polymers, paper, elastomers. So these are all under these Code of Federal Regulations. And there are the so-called food contact notifications. This is a pretty recent principle, which is like manufacturer-based, where like you as a manufacturer would apply for a pre-market approval under the FDA for your certain type of substance or material. Then there are the compliance policy guides, which the name already indicates these are guidelines. So these are not regulations, but for the materials which are under these compliance policy guides, there are no regulation in place. So that's the common practice to follow these guidelines then. And then the FDA has certain exemptions for materials which they consider as safe. And we're also going to look into that. So I'm going to start with ceramic, and I'm pretty sure you're well aware of that. Like, so the FDA regulated or like has compliance policy guidelines in place for the interior of ceramicware. So if you have like a bowl or a plate, so these guidelines are applicable for leachable lead and cadmium. And so this is something I want you to pay attention throughout the presentation with regards to the test method. So the test method is 4% acetic acid, 24 hours at room temperature, because this is kind of the good news, that for most of the regulations out there for ceramic, the test method is all the same. So that would basically mean you can do one test, and the requirements might be different, but you can do one test and then compare the results against the different requirements. And then I put out the different requirements out there. So they usually distinguish the products into different categories and then define requirements for the different categories for leachable lead and cadmium. And then it was already mentioned, so the lip and rim area, which is kind of this area, for example, in case you have a mug or you have a bowl where your limb touches the ceramic. And so this one is also food contact, and the FDA themselves, they don't really have any regulation on this, but they acknowledge the SGCD voluntary standard for leachable lead and cadmium. And then looking into glass and enamelware. So first of all, for pure glass, so like there are no added additives, like no pigments whatsoever, so just the pure glass, it's considered as glass, generally recognized as safe under the FDA. So this would be a so-called exemption. So once you have that, you don't need to do any further compliance tests, so you're already compliant. And then for others, like for decorated glass and enamelware, so generally the FDA is assuming that there's no more than insignificant migration of the pigment to the food. So they don't really specify any requirements for these. But they also don't say it's glass because they are not sure like what you put in there, like what kind of pigments you have in the decoration or what kind of pigments you have in the material. So basically they're putting the burden on the manufacturer and say like, okay, so it's your due diligence to make sure there's like no risk to the consumer, there are like no leachable metals. And so what we commonly see, specifically with retailers, that they would kind of voluntarily comply with the compliance policy guides for ceramic to at least have something in place. And then, so just to mention it, because I know tomorrow we have a big presentation on California Prop 65. And so here it's just like, of course, when you talk about the US for glass and ceramics, so you also have to mention Prop 65, which is kind of a very special thing out there. So because like they don't really define the requirements, right? So they only make it upon the exposure to the consumer, and the exposure shouldn't exceed any certain kind of limit. So that's why what most businesses out there do, they look at the existing settlements. And so there are settlements in place for a lot of like decorated glass and ceramic, and there's also one for tinted glass. So most of the customers we have, they want to comply with the most stringent settlement which is out there. And then I wanted to have a quick glance into Canada. So in Canada, these kind of household products, they fall under the Canadian Consumer Product Safety Act. And under the Safety Act, there is the glazed ceramics and glassware regulation. And so for the interior of the ceramic ware, they have exactly the same limits as we have here in the US under the FDA, so this is good. And then also for the lip and rim area, they actually directly incorporate the limits from the SGCD into their regulation. So that's pretty convenient. And so then I wanted to talk about the European Union, which I would say with regards to food contact is like the most complex market. This is because first of all, like we have two different levels. We have the harmonized European legislation for all the, like where the European Union basically would harmonize the requirements for all the countries, but then they didn't do it on a consistent basis. So there are many materials which it didn't harmonize. So then the member states can still issue their own legislation. So this is creating some kind of a complex patchwork. And then also I would say like the enforcement in the European Union is pretty strong. So the authorities are pretty active picking samples from the market, and it's quite different from what I see here in the US. So to give you like a general idea how it works in the EU, so I wanted to start on the European level, the harmonized level, and I wanted to start with the Framework Regulation 1935-2004, so you might have heard of that. So this is applicable for all kinds of food contact materials, and they put out like general requirements for any food contact material. So they should not endanger human health, they should not bring about an unacceptable change in the composition of the food, and they should not bring about a change in the organoleptic characteristics. And then basically it would be upon like the European Commission to define like what this means for an individual material, right? So like different materials, they would have different requirements in order to be safe. And so far they only do that for plastic and ceramic. So since we're talking about ceramic here, so we're gonna first look into ceramic. So the European Commission, they issued the Directive 84/500 EEC to regulate ceramic, and so the scope is the same what we had in the US and Canada, so also just leachable lead and cadmium. They divided 3 categories, and the limits, they're not the same as we have in the US or in Canada, but I would say they're in a comparable range. So the test method is the same as we had in the US and Canada, so it's 4% acetic acid, 24 hours at room temperature. And then something specific about the European Union for ceramic. So your products, they have to be accompanied by a DOC, like a so-called Declaration of Conformity, on all marketing stages. So basically this DOC would say that your product is compliant with the regulation. It's pretty simple, like there's no magic there, but you have to be able to back up this claim in case the authorities or a customer would ask you. You have to show documentation that it's really compliant. So for example, like a test report. And then what I was saying, so it's good that ceramic is harmonized on a European level, but the member states, they actually still have the option to apply like more stringent national requirements on top. And how this looks like, at least we're gonna see like some slides further. But before, I want to just give you some outlook what is happening on the European level with regards to the ceramic directive. So they actually, and it's already going on for a couple of years, they're working on a revision of the directive. And this is first and foremost because there's scientific data which indicates that the current limit for leachable lead and cadmium, they're not sufficient enough anymore, so they should be lowered. And then, so while they're working on the revision, they're also considering to add additional elements into the scope, right? Because pigments, they could include like way further elements than just lead and cadmium. They're also considering to add glass and enamel into the scope. And then they also consider to just open up the test conditions, because right now everything is tested at 24 hours at room temperature, right? But for example, if you have cookware, this might be not like the best test condition to really model the actual use of the product and to really model like the leaching behavior of the elements. So as I said, like this discussion is already going on for a couple of years. I would imagine it's still taking a couple of years until they publish a revision, so this is just a FYI. And in case you're interested, so like the European Reference Laboratory, they issued a technical report where they just studied all the migration behavior, I think from ceramic and enamelware. And so you can see like, the results of the study. So then with regards to glass and enamel on a general European level, they don't really have any regulation. So for glass, most of the time they apply the same requirements as for ceramic, so leachable lead and cadmium and the same limits. For enamel, so there was recently a new standard issued where they would define test methods and limits for enamelware in contact with food. And this is quite different so from all the others, like all the other regulations we have seen so far. So the test is done with 3% acetic acid and actual use conditions. So that's already different. So you would always adjust the actual test conditions based on how you use the product. So for example, in case you have a mug, you could fill like hot beverages inside, right? So you wouldn't test at room temperature, but you would test at 70 degrees Celsius, for example. And then they're looking into the release of 16 elements, so it's not only lead and cadmium anymore. 16 elements, and they took the elements and the limits from a European guideline, the so-called EDQM guideline, for release of heavy metals from metal materials. And so, as I said, this is a standard. It's like an EN ISO standard, so you don't have to do it. But because in Europe, like you always have to be compliant with the framework regulation, and you have to kind of, you kind of have to make sure you can demonstrate that your product is safe and there's no danger for human health. So this is kind of a nice way to actually back up this claim and say like, hey, so I'm compliant with the standard, so which kind of reflects the current state of the art. So, I'm sorry. Yeah, so that was for enamel. And then we're gonna look into the national legislation in Europe. And so I just put this as a visual in here, so you don't really have to read all this, and it's also not up to date anymore. So this is like a table the European Commission had on their website. So basically explaining for which kind of food contact materials, like which European member state has their own national requirement. So whenever you see like a plus in there indicated, right here, that would mean like this country has a national requirement for certain materials. So as you can see, they also like quite some plus for ceramic, even we said that is actually something harmonized. So that means like, as I said, so countries can make their own like more stringent requirement on top. And that's what I was talking about, like you have this complicated patchwork in Europe. And so just to make it a little bit more visual, so I wanted to give the example of 3 European member states, which I think are the most active with regards to food contact materials, so France, Germany, and Italian. So first about France. So they have a notice for food contact suitability of inorganic materials. So inorganic materials means here like glass, ceramic, and enamel. So then for the interior, they have to implement the EU requirements, so 84/500. So leachable lead and cadmium, so the same as we had in the beginning. But then on top, they also restrict the release of aluminum, cobalt, and arsenic. And then they also have requirements for the lip and rim area. And then glass and enamel, so basically the same, and they also regulate chromium-6 on top. And then also for the lip and rim area, they restrict leachable lead, cadmium, and chromium-6. In Germany, it's pretty interesting. So they don't really have anything like additional regulation on the German level. So they just incorporate the 84/500 international law, so they have to do that. But then, as I was explaining, like you always have to comply with the 1935-2004, so, and German authorities are pretty active. So they actually also go after elements which are not even regulated. So for example, we have seen several claims from German authorities where they would enforce limits from the Austrian ceramic ordinance, so including limits with zinc, on zinc, antimony, and barium. And then they, for example, also go after cobalt. So even like there's no actual like regulation in place, but they always, you know, they always argue like with toxicological limits and any kind of harm for human health. Yeah, so we would always suggest to also monitor these elements for the German market. In Italy, for ceramic, they incorporated the 84/500, so this is pretty straightforward and no additional requirements on top. For glass, it looks a bit different, so they do an overall migration, which is like a general concept they have in Italy. They basically do to all food contact materials, so basically you just check like the total extractive amount from the material. And then they also have restrictions on the leachable lead amount for lead crystalware. And the test conditions, they are different from what we've seen so far, and they are also different based on what type of glass you actually have. And then for enamel, so you also do an overall migration. And then so the Italian Ministry of Health, they like some years ago, like 3 or 4 years ago, they issued a notice for migration of metals for metalware and also enamel, where they would basically say that only monitoring like leachable lead and cadmium is not sufficient. So you basically have to make an assessment of what kind of pigments you have in there and what kind of potential leachable elements are in there, and then to monitor that. And so last but not least, I wanted to look into Asia. So what kind of requirements they have for this kind of food contact wear. So I want to start with Japan. And one thing which is very specific about Asian food contact regulations is that for testing, you need to find an approved labs. So the authority, they have a system of approved test labs, and if you go to the customs or if you have like any problem with the authority, they would only accept test reports from these approved labs. And here just giving you some examples. So this is actually what I think is always nice about the Asian regulations, because you see like here in the US or in Europe, like for some of these materials, you have this kind of like wishy-washy regulatory situation that you kind of have to be compliant, but they don't exactly tell you what you have to do in order to be compliant. In Asia, I think it's usually well defined what you have to do. So for ceramic, they also go after leachable lead and cadmium. Test method is 4% acetic acid, 24 hours at room temperature. And then for glass and enamel, they have like a similar principle. In Korea, it's the same thing. So first of all, like for official testing, they only accept test labs within Korea. So for example, for Japan, like our test lab in Hong Kong is able to do the testing, but for Korea, we would partner with the test lab in Korea because we don't have a lab in Korea. And then they also have well-defined requirements for all the different materials. So ceramic, they go after leachable lead, cadmium, and arsenic. Glass, they go after leachable lead and cadmium, and then enamel, leachable lead, cadmium, and antimony. And then China, so they just recently revised their whole system of food contact legislation and published the new standards in 2017. So they have a system of the so-called GB Guobiao, like the national standards. And so you also would have to do the testing in one of the accredited test labs in order to have an official test report. And basically for the materials in question, so they have one standard for each of the materials. And so I just copied the example of ceramic in there. So they go after leachable lead and cadmium, and for different categories. And the test conditions are a bit different here. So for example, like for cookware, they don't say, also just like, they don't say like you do everything at 24 hours at room temperature. So for example, for cookware, they suggest like boiling temperature, which I think is generally the trend in compliance testing. And so this is just from our an overview of our labs, which is not completely complete, but yeah, this is how I wanted to end this presentation. So, are there any questions?
Concerning cobalt,
Yeah.
in Europe especially, that's leachable cobalt
Yes,
or
yes.
not contact?
That's all leachable, yeah. Yeah.
According to this, what would be the most strict legislation in each country?
Yeah.
Still California or?
I don't think that's the thing you can say the most stringent. So what I usually suggest clients to do, and this is actually pretty convenient for ceramic, is that you can do one test, as I said, and then you actually compare the limits to each of the legislations. No more questions.